Again, thank you, Brian, for a very generous introduction. He's also such a generous friend in introducing me. He's like already helping you, make good excuses for my flaws ahead of time. So that's a very good friend. There's a lot that one might cover with respect to neuroscientific challenges to Aquinas' anthropology. Someone who wants to defend a sort of Thomist anthropology in the Thomist tradition, as I do. And that's what I'm going to focus on are some of the ways in which we might want to tackle some of these issues. But it's difficult often to get clear. It's really difficult to get clear on what are the real as opposed to the apparent challenges that are coming from neuroscience to Aquinas' anthropology. And I want to think about two major sorts of difficulties. One is differentiating the psychosomatic powers, the sentient powers, and coordinating them with neurobiology. Those are all the sensory powers that Aquinas would have thought would have been embodied. And the second is thinking about the interaction of intellectual or noetic powers, which are thought to be disembodied, as we've already heard a little bit today. Both, how would you defend that today, that there are these disembodied intellectual powers? And then second, what is their relationship to these embodied powers? And why is the Aristotelian Thomist view so often misunderstood by philosophers of mind, as well as then any neuroscientists that would typically encounter it only as mediated through philosophy of mind? I'm going to focus mostly today, I'm going to cover a lot of territory rather than focusing on any particular problems or issues. But I'm going to focus mostly on some of the issues that might be raised about how do you distinguish or differentiate or individuate different sentient or psychosomatic powers and their relationships to neurobiology. Basically, two parts of the talk are going to be like, what is Aquinas' anthropology? So if you were to try to defend that today, there's an exigent requirement to actually have a pretty good exegetical handle on what Aquinas was really about. What were the strengths and limitations of Aquinas' anthropology in the 13th century? What were the strengths and limitations of Aquinas' anthropology in the last 700 years? And how would it confront, if we think of ourselves as Aquinas' disputed questions, were trying to raise the best objections against the theses he wanted to put forward. And he was satisfied in the truth of those theses because they could confront the best objections. Well, now we have 700 years of disputed questions that we need to raise, and if we want to defend these theses, we have to be able to respond to the best of those objections. So all my little tags about Aquinas after this, it's not necessarily like we shouldn't be just clearly deferential and think Aquinas is right still, but we also need not think that we have to give these things up. Why should we maintain or give up a thesis is how does it handle itself when it confronts in a disputed question format the best objections that have been raised of? Do they survive? Do they survive with minor revisions? Do they survive with major revisions? And the second half then, after we've said just a little bit about what is Aquinas' anthropology, then we're going to test some of these taxonomies, looking at not just challenges to Aquinas, but ways that philosophy also challenges neuroscience itself. So, roughly, what is Aquinas' anthropology? I'm going to talk about the way in which he gets to the sort of account of human nature by first talking about the psychology of the objects, the psychological operations, and the psychological powers, and how those inform what they're grounded in. So we have our access to the natures of things by looking at the things that are a little bit more superficial, the activities and the things that different animals, including humans, do. That tells us about their nature, their ontology. But if you think about the metaphysics, the reason why they do those things is because of the nature, the kind of ontology that they have. So we'll first start talking about the psychology of objects and operations and powers. On the back side of your handout, you have this diagram, which is a very kind of scholastic presentation of these things. But the first task that they inherited from Aristotle tells them in his own Psychology, Book 2, Chapter 4, we want to know about the nature of the soul, we want to know about these animals. How do we know about the nature of the animals? How do we distinguish dogs and cats and humans? Well, we need to know, what are their different powers? Dogs and cats and humans have different powers, and that's how we distinguish what their different natures are. But how do we know what the different powers of dogs and cats and humans and plants are? We need to see the different things they do, their different activities of their operations. And those operations or objects, or those activities are specified by the different objects, like what are the kind of things that those operations make manifest or make available. So Aquinas, following a long Aristotelian tradition mediated by Avicenna, Verres, and a bunch of others, arrives at, I've skipped all the vegetative powers, but these are all the sentient, in this column on the right, these are all the powers that Aquinas arrives at for sentient and intellectual powers. And the way he arrives at this is following a lot of his predecessors. I mean, we all can just do the one that we teach our children. I'm not teaching my newborn yet, but I've tried. It's not working yet. But things like the five senses. We teach them the five senses by saying something like, well, you see the visibles or you see colors. The object is color. The operation is seeing. And the power is called seeing or the power is called vision. So the way that this sort of thing works is that you start from the unity of your experiences. You take in a unified, colored shaped magnitudes, all sitting relatively, not moving, not running to the door, a bunch of human beings, and you take that unity and you start demarcating that conscious unity that of the experience into what are the different objects that we can distinguish within that unity. And we can distinguish in that there are visible objects. I'm not tasting any of you, but and we're especially not supposed to right now, but there's tangible objects you can touch. There's olfactable objects. Hopefully the people sitting next to you don't smell too much. There are various audible objects, and then there's the visible objects. And then they also went through and they thought, well, what are the other kind of psychological objects and operations we engage in? Well, based on the things we sense, we can also imagine things after we've sensed them. So there's imaginables and there's operations of imagination. And they work through the way in which these activities work together. Sometimes they work apart. And that's how they went through this whole long division of different types of intellectual and sensory powers. And as you'll see as you go down in the list, there's not just cognitive powers, there's also various appetitive powers. So Aquinas has these concupiscible and irascible appetites, which have to do with the kinds of passions or emotions we have for things like loving, hating, desiring, avoiding, enjoying, and sorrow. Things like that. So it's quite a long, detailed set of disputed questions that Aquinas gets into with people like Albert the Great, who don't necessarily agree about how you divide up these objects and these operations. One complicated, alarming way of thinking about the flow here is we're going from the external senses to what Aquinas describes as the sensus communis, this unifying sense. And that allows for sensibles to go off to imagination. Perceptibles, which I won't get into the details of, goes off to this power called cogitation. That goes to memory, our retention of the things that we've already cognized or done before. And those contribute to a phantasm that the agent intellect abstracts and gives you the possible intellect. That's actually forming concepts on the basis of these intelligible species. And then you have all these affective things, or appetitive things here on the bottom. Somatic affections like pleasures and pains, which Aquinas is pretty thin on that, except for in Christology. When he talks about Christ's passion, that's the only time he really goes into great detail about bodily pleasures and pains. And they have a weird, ambiguous relationship, actually, in Aquinas' Anthropology to emotions or passions and the concupiscible and irascible appetites. And then we have the will, as well as a whole range of motile powers, powers for engaging in motion. So, as you can see, this is very complicated, and even the way I've set this up, there are people who would disagree about how you would exegete and read Aquinas, that this is not necessarily the layout that one would arrive at. What's not disputed in Aquinas is that these are the powers. If you look at Disputed Questions on the Soul 13, he lays all these powers out right there, or you can look at questions 78 through 82 in the Prima Pars, where Aquinas will also lay all these powers. But the basic division is external senses, which everyone should be familiar with, and then this different debates about internal senses. These are still powers that are embodied. They're embodied in the brain, as we're going to see. Aquinas thinks they're embodied in the brain. He says so. Powers like imagination, powers like cogitation, which are like, again, it's for like noticing individuals or objects of desire or objects of avoidance. Like the bird sees in the straw, not just that it's gold and then it's shiny, but that it's an object that could be used for building a nest. And then we've got these appetites. Now, all the ones in gray, these are all the embodied powers. So they're going to have an organ somewhere in the human being for them. And they think the external senses have pretty obvious organs. Vision has the eyes, hearing has the ears, and so on and so forth. But what organs do you think Aquinas thought these internal sense powers are located? What organs do you think they have? And then Aquinas, quite traditionally in this time, and for this Aristotelian tradition, they thought these intellectual powers, the possible intellect, the agent intellect, and the will, they thought all of those were disembodied. They don't have an organ. So there's one human being who their substantial form and their matter grounds all of these powers, but some of the powers they ground are embodied and are, as I'm going to suggest, they're even like zones of hylomorphic organization in the body. And then there are these disembodied intellectual powers. The biggest empirical transformation of Aristotelian hylomorphism with respect to the psychology is not like the discovery of the neuron doctrine. It's the Aristotelian shift to the Galenic doctrine that the brain is the actual center of our psychology. Because Aristotle, in his anatomy, he disagreed with the Hippocratic writings, and he disagreed with the Platonists. He didn't think the brain was the place where in which sensory and motor information is integrated and conducted. And that's in part because Aristotle thought, and his anatomy was such that they didn't make a differentiation between nerves and the circulatory system. And so for Aristotle, it looked as if everything is coming from the out extremities, going into the heart, and then going back out. By the time you get to Galen, Galen is making some anatomical divisions within the Aristotelian tradition of the difference between the nervous system, which is actually sending things to the spinal cord up into the head, as separate from the circulatory system. So the biggest empirical discovery for Aristotelian psychology and hylomorphism occurred in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. And the most fruitful time period of Aristotelian hylomorphism came after that. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, from a historical point of view, and then major empirical conceptual changes, that's when it happened. And neuroscience is not actually like a formidable new empirical discovery putting in challenge, or putting in question the hylomorphism and the psychology. So that kind of structure is basically going to be more or less intact. There's only going to be some minor revisions. That said, when they adopted the Galen doctrine, they thought that you had to have a special kind of fluid, a special kind of spirits, not just vital fluids, but like a kind of spiritual fluid, a sort of psychic fluid that was going through the nerves and into the brain. And they thought that the brain had some large cavities. It had some ventricles. And these are the kind of diagrams that we see in 13th, 14th century manuscripts of what they thought the internal organs of the brain were these large cavities. And beginning already with Galen, finding it in Augustine, finding it in Nemesius, finding it in Avicenna, and Aquinas is just really following suit. They took these internal sense powers I referred to, and these were the organs for these internal sense powers. And again, I think that they're supposed to be thought of as having a more or less hylomorphic relationship. Just as the power of vision is like the form or the soul of the eye, and just as the soul is the form of the whole human body, you might say that the common sense and the imagination, they're like the form of the anterior ventricle. And the cogitative or estimative power is like the form of the medial ventricle. So this is their doctrine. It's still a doctrine that's held basically up till Thomas Willis here at Oxford and Descartes, when they start switching not to the ventricles, but shifting to actual tissues that are like surrounding the ventricles. Descartes with the pineal, which is going to be close to the central ventricle as far as they're understanding it. And Thomas Willis is going to look at the corpus callosum as the sort of major tissue. But they're already thinking about things in a non-Aristotelian way when they're thinking about the connections between them. There's one other point I want to make here. It's not even Leonardo da Vinci. We have his illustrations where he, early on in his career, did this basic doctrine, laid out these sorts of illustrations, and then he's thinking, are these cavities really just big cavities like that? Big, like, linear circles? So he decided to inject wax into a cow's brain and fill these ventricles with wax, and then afterwards did the dissection and saw that, well, the lateral ventricles are more like a horn shape, and all this is very different. So that's really like some of the early explosions in anatomy, going from, I think his earlier illustrations are around like 1496, and then the later illustrations around 1502, 1503 is when some of those shifts happen. So, as you can see, Aquinas thought he had to have these psychological powers. He thought they had to be embodied in the brain. He's disagreeing with Aristotle on that, but there's already 1,000, 1,500-year tradition of having made that transition and how to think about it. So Aquinas' basic view would be something like, human beings are rational animals. It's not the eye that sees or the intellect that understands, nor the brain, but it's rather the human that sees and understands by exercising their powers of vision, of intellect, of memory being in the posterior ventricle. Humans have brains, but they're not identical to their brains. It's humans and other animals, not their brains, that see, hear, perceive, execute voluntary bodily movements, and so on and so forth with all these things, these different psychological operations. Nevertheless, they would have thought that having a brain or having these different ventricles, those are going to be necessary conditions. And that's why Aquinas thinks when you have damage to the posterior ventricle, people have memory problems. And if you have memory problems, the intellect isn't able to engage with the phantasms that are formed by these embodied sensory powers, and that was what impedes intellection. So you might think, Thomas thinks the intellect is immaterial. People have brain damage. Soldiers have all sorts of things that happen to them. Thomas doesn't have a very good reason for why there's intellectual incapacities in these people who have brain damage. But actually his theory had a pretty straightforward account of that, is that the intellect brings about the coordinated manifestations of these embodied powers, but if those embodied powers are damaged, the intellect can't actually bring that up. So you might find that a more or less plausible story, but the point is that was already an issue in the 13th century. That's not something that neuroscience is bringing some new sort of empirical discoveries to bear on why that might be a problem. So that's just, again, very, very fast. That's contentious, but that's at least my exegetical reading of a number of moves in Aquinas on how he lays out his psychology of objects, operations, and powers. And he thinks of them all as being grounded some way in the ontology of human nature. So we use them to think about and discover what is human nature, but then retrospectively the metaphysics is actually, at the end of the day, what's grounding the powers that we use to discover that human nature. We've already heard quite a bit about hylomorphism, so I thank everyone before for laying that out so clearly for me. Maybe I can skip some slides. So humans are rational animals, and they're fundamental entities. They're not made up of fundamental entities. They are among the fundamental entities. They're unified psychosomatic wholes that are more than the sum of their parts. And then because they're hylomorphic substances, they're going to be composed of matter and form, where the rational soul is what is the substantial form. Its substantial form actualizes its material parts. It endows the animal with its identity and subsistence conditions and grounds its panoply of powers and the different operations. As I was suggesting earlier on my reading, these embodied powers, they're like in the accidental order, so to speak, are constituted from the formal organization of material organs, and those embodied operations of those powers are also constituted from a kind of formal organization of the coordinated manifestations or actualization of embodied powers. All I mean by this is that whenever the posterior and the medial ventricles, if memory and cogitation are doing something together, the fluids are flowing together in a kind of co-organized kind of way. So the idea is that when the powers are activated, they're enlisting whatever powers are in the fluids of those organs, because they actually partially are formally and materially constituted from those organs. Okay. And then, as we've heard before today, with I'm raising objections from Scotus and others about this, Aquinas did hold that the rational soul, it's not the human person, but the rational soul is immaterial for Aquinas. He defends the rational soul and the intellectual powers are immaterial. And so it's essentially dependent on the body for the completion of human nature and the complete human person. But existentially, the rational soul and its powers are independent of the body, because the rational soul's subsistence is not dependent on the body. And that's why Aquinas thinks that the rational soul is incorruptible. It doesn't corrupt with the human body when a human dies. So, again, very, very fast going through this. But let's think now about, if this was a plausible reading of Thomas and someone was inclined to defend this, what would the disputed questions look like that would raise the substantive objections against this view that you would have to respond to in order to defend the truth of some of these commitments? And my own views about this sort of thing, even coming at it from a neuroscience perspective, is almost all the issues are like philosophical issues before they are actually neuroscientific issues. So you have to do a lot of philosophy, you have to sift through a lot of just the neuroscience from a philosophical point of view, and really figure out what are the ways you should interpret these experiments, and what are the kind of ways in which some of them have teeth or objections against your view and which ones don't. And that's in part because whenever you design a psychology experiment, say like the Libet experiments on free will, you have to have some concept of voluntary action, some concept of a volition, some concept of an intention that didn't come out of the empirical world. It came out of your everyday life and experiences. It comes out of judicial and legal proceedings. It comes out of different God help us, philosophy debates. It comes out of all these sorts of things. And then whatever that background is, that concept of free will, wherever it came from, that finds its way into the design of an experiment. Say the Libet experiment. But Libet's only using a particular concept of free will that was popular in the 1960s and 70s that John Eccles was influenced by, which is a type of property emergent dualist kind of view. And it's a very specific view about free will, and it has to be that way. But we have to, then when you go to these experiments, you need to ask, would I be committed to that concept of free will that got operationalized in this neuroscience experiment? Would I then interpret the data in the same way because I do or don't accept that concept of free will? Same thing goes for long-term memory, for thinking about the nature of vision, for thinking about the auditory cortex, thinking about consciousness, all these things. The concepts that they deploy come from somewhere outside. They're extra psychological, extra neuroscientific that get brought in. And a lot of complicated, contentious philosophical work has to be done on those concepts first. But today I'm going to mostly focus just on philosophical challenges to Aquinas' anthropology. And then I'm going to bring up ways in which some of them get mediated then through some of these neuroscientific challenges. So recall again this very complicated diagram that fortunately for all of you it's on the back of your handout. The blue is meant to indicate all the powers that are embodied. Okay? Being a Thomist, I have this tendency myself, but it's definitely a tendency we have, that we tend to take our contentious taxonomies out of the texts. But we don't necessarily always provide a philosophical articulation. If you were to re-present this as a disputed question, how would you re-arrive at that taxonomy? I mean, first, how would you justify this principle, object, specify operation, specify powers, specify nature? But if you could defend that, and there's all these good powers people here that defend something kind of like that, you individuate powers through their manifestations. But that's not going to necessarily solve the problem of, well, why did you define those 13 objects and those 13 operations? Maybe memory and imagination aren't that different from each other. Maybe there's more kinds of memory than are listed here. Why are you dividing the passions into irascible and concupiscible passions? Maybe there's just different subdivisions here. How would you deal with that disputed question, and how would you ask that disputed question in a sophisticated way? The first problem is philosophers tend to forget that the reason why they ask the questions that are involved in the debates they're in are largely for sociological reasons. You found yourself in this department, and these people work on this thing, and these are the publications you read, and this is the thing you need to engage in and publish with your respect to your arguments and your debates. Thomists are going to be guilty as much as analytic philosophers of mind, as much as Wittgensteinians, as much as phenomenologists, and the reason why any of them can't agree is because of these really fundamental disagreements, and that's often the reason for why they just can't even talk to each other. So this is an attempt to try to tell you how they could talk to each other. The first is they need to be more honest about what common sense is. And the thing about common sense is that there's no such thing as common sense. It's highly culturally differentiated. And our different ways of thinking about our own psychology are really influenced significantly by theories, by non-theories, by long histories. And we shouldn't expect our common sense ways of talking about ourselves psychologically to be rigorous and regimented and policed really, really carefully. And we should also probably be disinclined to listen to philosophers or psychologists who try to police our everyday language to a radical degree. Now, I'm taking a strong philosophical stand about philosophers not telling folk psychology or common sense psychology to be the way it is. That would be another debate. But it is the case that we need to ask, now that I've found myself 20 years, 15 years, 10 years into theorizing in a certain way, how would I philosophically justify having been theorizing this way for these last decade or so? If I'm a phenomenologist, why am I a phenomenologist in the first place rather than a Wittgensteinian? Am I a philosopher of mind? Why am I a philosopher of mind and not a Wittgensteinian? And if I'm an Aristotelian Thomist, why am I not any of those things? And what bearing do all of these different psychological taxonomies have with respect to everyday life? I mean, how are they held accountable by everyday discussions and conversations? So here I'm proposing 3 ways to think of different disputed questions that a Thomist has to go through. They kind of have to go through in this order, but I don't think of them as this is never a task that's done. This is a sort of recursive task of constantly jumping in at multiple levels and getting back out again. So the first is thinking about how do we begin more rigorously and carefully theorizing about our psychology in the first place? How do we go from our everyday common sense, which is already influenced by all sorts of theories, and how do we think about moving from that to a more careful, theoretical, descriptive psychology? And I'm saying we have to go take Aquinas' experiential anthropology after looking at the insights that we can find in phenomenology, some that we can find from Wittgensteinians, and some that comes from non-philosophical sources like ethnography or looking at cultural anthropology and some of these sources. The second is getting into more theoretical anthropology. Aquinas himself, after he differentiated all those objects and operations and powers, he then was thinking about the best brain science of his day, the ventricle doctrine. And he's trying to situate, how do I take my theoretical psychology and how do I situate it with respect to the best empirical brain science or psychology of the day? We're going to have to do something similar with taking our theoretical psychology, and it's going to require problematizing some of the concepts that are already deployed in contemporary neuroscience and psychology, as well as realizing that it does raise some challenges to the way in which we do our theory independent from the experimental bench. And finally, I think a lot of this takes place at a relatively superficial ontology. It's not really clear yet which of these powers are really metaphysically powers in like a real serious sense. And so there's going to be a metaphysical debate too about drawing on the resources of analytic metaphysics to think more perspicuously and more principally, how do we distinguish these different powers? It might turn out there's only 3 psychological powers. It might turn out there's 30. We're going to have to engage in those debates. So focusing on this first one. And this is on your handout on the first page. What phenomenology provides people like Husserl, especially in the more realist moments of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, thinking about embodied perception, some of the things in Heidegger, as well as some of Sartre's fantastic reflections on consciousness. They have a really rich accounts of our embodied experience, polymorphic, the way in which consciousness is many-formed, accounts of our objects of conscious, practical, and theoretical operations. The problem is it gets very untidy, and it kind of goes all over the place. And it doesn't necessarily have a clear way of catching itself up or handing off the baton to metaphysical reflections. So there's certain limitations to phenomenological approaches. We also need to draw on history of ideas and ethnography to sort of interrogate Aquinas' as well as our own enculturated psychological nomenclature. But the one I really want to focus on very briefly is to talk about some of the things that Wittgensteinians have been able to offer us in the past and are often ignored too frequently. So once again, this taxonomy. Why this subdivision of these objects and why this subdivisions of these operations? Like, how did we arrive at those? I mean, they might seem sort of intuitive, but there's all sorts of ways in which we might raise certain questions about this division. One of the things one of Wittgenstein's commentators, Peter Hacker, has laid out is that what Wittgenstein does for trying to sift through our concepts and shed light on them is you can find something like 21 parameters that Wittgenstein clearly was deploying when he thinks about the will and willing, or thinking about memory and what is remembering. And what we need to do, not as if this is the end, although some Wittgensteinians basically say this is the whole business of psychology and you're done once you've laid all this out, is you need to go through and take all of those different psychological concepts, as well as ones that Aquinas doesn't have up here, and you'd have to go through all of these different parameters, and you need to think about what's the difference between talking about first-person seeing and talking about knowing someone else is seeing? What's the difference between saying I'm hearing and saying you can see that they're hearing that in the other room because they're all fleeing when they hear the fire alarm? What's the difference between when I say I know this and when I'm saying they know this? So these first and third person differences in the way in which we use our concepts. There's going to be different types of epistemic asymmetries in the way in which we know that someone is thinking versus when I know that I'm thinking, when I know someone else is in pain versus when I'm in pain. There's also going to be applications of temporality. Can you apply temporality to all of these different concepts or all these different psychological operations? Do they all take time, or are some of them instantaneous? Are some of them not only take time, but they take a great deal of effort and habituation before you can engage in them? So, as you can see, this is a really long, tedious process, but this would be like to raise a bunch of disputed questions about why Thomas or anyone has the psychological taxonomy that they've arrived at so far. Hacker lays out roughly this sort of subdivision, and you'd have to ask not only why this subdivision, but why all the other different taxonomies? You open up a textbook in cognitive psychology, and you'll just see a host of different disagreements about different taxonomies. You look at long-term memory and short-term memory, or long-term memory and working memory, all the different kind of procedural memories, and you have to ask, why are all these things being called memory? To engage in that debate is going to be requiring going through something like this and sifting through all these things. Now, just taking hackers as an example, it's not authoritative at all, but these are the things that Aquinas' anthropology are missing. So Aquinas doesn't have any kind of really clear, helpful division between feelings that are sensations and affections that are attitudes or moods. He has something like the emotions in his account of the passions. But again, I said his somatic pleasures and pains, they have an ambiguous relationship in him to emotions, and they aren't really clearly worked out. Aquinas doesn't have a detailed account of self-consciousness. He has some cryptic passages in De Veritate 10.8 and a few places in Summa Contra Gentiles, but it's not anything that's really developed. And so we'd have to ask, should we have an account of self-consciousness? Aquinas doesn't subdivide memory into factual and personal. So we'd have to ask, is he missing something? And if you look at all the long-term memory studies, which distinguish between something like episodic memory and semantic memory, they would think that he is missing something pretty huge by doing this. So anyhow, I'm trying to show this is really hard and really difficult, and I hope that that's being relayed and communicated. We can't just take the taxonomy out of the text. You're going to have to engage in these sort of very difficult, disputed questions. And this is just to give us the starting point, right? I think it's J.L. Austin who says that language isn't the final word, but it is the first word. You're going to have to first deal with this stuff and then see where the theory is going to go from there. Similarly, this also applies to what's going on, I think, in contemporary cognitive neuroscience. And I know this is not necessarily a thing philosophers or psychologists like, but I'm quite a fan of Peter Hacker's work. My difference is that he doesn't want to go on to theory afterwards, and I think that we have to go on to theory afterwards. And I think we're going to need an ontology to justify some of the distinctions. But that's the same thing I'm telling is an objection to Aquinas. These sort of same procedures are going to be objections to a lot of the things in cognitive neuroscience as well. All right, now we're stepping out from this first pass theory of a division. If you were to lay out a huge, complicated division of how we're going to kind of regiment our psychological terminology, get a feeling on the way we use intentional, non-intentional, the way in which we use voluntary, non-voluntary, the way in which we talk about seeing and hearing, all these kinds of things. How do we then go and actually start looking at the neuroscience and the psychology? Again, this is on your handout. These are a number of tasks that one would have to do. I'm just going to skip ahead and focus on one distinction that I think is actually really fruitful, that Thomas doesn't have, but is actually a very illuminating distinction that he could, and Thomas should, I think, adopt and use. I think there's something tacitly like this in Aquinas, but since we know so much more about the material components that are involved in our embodied psychological powers, that we need to be more careful and cautious about this. Daniel Dennett is the first one to make this kind of distinction the way I'm making it. He distinguishes between the personal and the subpersonal, but then in my estimation, as well as in the estimation of John McDowell and Jennifer Hornsby, he basically gives it all up once he goes with the intentional stance. So it was a good distinction. He adopts something else that basically, I think, undercuts it later on. So I'm not wed to Dennett's view. As you're going to see, I'm going to hylomorphize it, and so it's clearly going to be different than Dennett's, but it does originally come from him. He also personal, subpersonal, and I want to be a little bit more broad and think about animals, and so I'm thinking of it in terms of a subpsychological and psychological. So by psychological level, I just mean the kind of conscious awareness, perceptions, emotions, memories, imaginations, inquiries, insights, reflective judgments, reasonings, all these things. That's the psychological level. But all of these psychological factors are often undergirded with subpsychological, biological factors, a number of biological systems. So they're going to be subdivisions of the nervous system. We're going to also have powers that are going to have, cardiovascular system is involved here, the digestive system. There's a lot of interesting research right now in the relationship of your gut microbiota with respect to your nervous system, things like that. So there are all sorts of subpsychological systems. And a lot of confusions happen when we start using these psychological concepts to describe the explanatory role of the subpsychological. So the hippocampus might be really important for long-term memory, but we shouldn't be saying the hippocampus is what remembers. The hippocampus is engaged in different kinds of special pyramidal cells and other cells in the hippocampus that have different kinds of neural assemblies, different kinds of spike trains of action potentials. That's the kind of thing that a hippocampus does. Now, it's clearly a subpsychological factor for memory, but we shouldn't be describing these subpsychological powers as engaged in the activities that the psychological ones are. So it's a contentious distinction, but I think one that's eminently defensible, and I think it's necessary to avoid a lot of confusions that sometimes occur in these domains. The way I would think about it hylomorphically is what I say here at the bottom, that these subpsychological capacities of our nervous system, they materially constitute and enable the psychological capacities. They're kind of like the matter with respect to the form, is the way I'm thinking about them. That's very important because I'm not thinking of this in terms of a mental-physical dichotomy. Again, these embodied powers are all physical. They're not the mental over here and the physical over here, the mental as somehow something, a separate property acting down on the nervous system as something physical. These embodied powers are zones of hylomorphic organization in the nervous system. But it's also important to say it's not a panacea. One, you have to defend the distinction, and two, there's a lot more work that has to be done once you've made the distinction. That lot more work is how do you coordinate then all these different psychological level attributes with neurological and other biological. Another thing that's going on is we might discover the neuron doctrine is really radically incomplete. There are a lot of these glial cells and astrocytes and things like that that are in the nervous system that we thought had a maintenance role, but now we're seeing that glial cells and other things are having intercommunicational signaling with the neurons just as much. So it might be the case in 10 or 20 years we're talking about neuroglial science as much as just neuroscience. So there's still a lot of biology that we don't know, even in the nervous system itself. But how are we going to coordinate the psychological stuff with the subpsychological? It's going to work in different levels ontologically from the kind of experimental empirical approach. We shouldn't be thinking these two levels are doing the same thing. The ontological is, again, being an Aristotelian, it's going to be a hylomorphic approach, and I'm putting that at odds with the mental-physical dichotomy kind of approach, which I think is presumed by monisms and dualisms in the philosophy of mind. Again, for hylomorphism, the psychological, the subpsychological is as form is to matter, just as soul is to body, or like the power of vision is to the eye. Okay? So clearly I'm scrapping the ventricles doctrine that Aquinas had, but I'm bringing in some other subpsychological doctrine. We've got either a neuron system or a neuroglial system, or neuroglial systems also with a cardiovascular system, and all these things are systems that are subpsychological matter with respect to the hylomorphically organized embodied psychological powers. What are some of the pressing issues scientifically that we need to reconcile this hylomorphic account to? There are a bunch of debates. I'm just going to talk about two. One is this debate about localism, holism, and reuse in neuroscience, and the other has to do with the approach called the New Mechanist Approach in philosophy of biology and neuroscience. That slide was supposed to come earlier. So just the idea that's going on here is the psychological level is where you're talking about the powers and the operations of something like vision and audition, or memory, and where Aquinas would have thought the power of vision was the eye, and he would have thought that the organ of vision would have been the eye, the organ of audition would have been the ear, and he would have said the power of memory, the organ of memory would have been the posterior ventricle. What I'm saying we say instead, because of the empirical science, is thinking about the organized material components of these psychosomatic powers are not just the eye, not just the ear, certainly not the lateral ventricle, but rather we want to be thinking about the visual nervous system, okay? A highly distributed thing that includes the eye, includes the optic nerve, the optic chiasm, features of the thalamus, features of the auditory cortex, as well as a lot of stuff probably in the parietal lobe, as well as maybe some things even in the frontal lobe are pretty relevant to features. The visual system might be highly distributed for what we want to think of it. Same thing with memory. Not just going to be the medial temporal lobe and the hippocampus and the perirhinal cortex. It's probably highly distributed. So that then brings us to this debate that's been going on for a long time, and it's going to keep going on. What should we think about the architecture of the nervous system with respect to our psychological or cognitive powers? Is it going to be like a one-to-one mapping? We've got a power of vision, and there's going to be one place in the brain that does the vision stuff. Or we've got a power of memory, and there's one place in the brain where the memory stuff is done. And that's what a modularity or localist view would be. And so you might say nodes A, or nodes 1, 2, and 3, those are all used for memory, but they're not used except for 2. One node in the brain is used for memory insofar as memory is somehow connected with maybe facial recognition or something like that. But otherwise, the visual stuff is all 2, 4, 5, and 6. So it's a highly localized system where one area only does one thing, and they maybe sometimes overlap in the way in which that node participates in another modal complex of neural circuitry, but often this one area of the brain does one psychological thing, this other area of the brain, it has this proprietary psychological function. Another view historically has been a kind of holism. And some of the functionalist cognitive neuroscience ways of thinking about the nervous system, thinking of it in kind of a holist way, any part of the brain could do any other thing that any other part of the brain could do. So you could have the visual system in the frontal lobe. It's just like an evolutionary fluke that the information's coming in and the way the anatomy is disposed, that it's going all the way back to the occipital lobe. But it could have been different. Okay, so a holist view is one where they're thinking a lot more like computer chips, where the parts in the neurons and the neural assemblies, they could do anything if they just had the right information flow within a hierarchy. Another view is a kind of view called neural reuse, which has been discussed by Michael Anderson in Phenomenology, and there's a BBS paper he wrote a while ago on this topic as well. And this is a view where different nodes actually get reused in combination for different kinds of psychological activities. Now, Aquinas was clearly a really strong modalist, a really strong localist, right? He's saying the cogitative power was in that middle ventricle. He was saying that memory was in the posterior ventricle. But I don't think there's any reason that a hylomorphous has to be wed to that kind of thing. I find this neural reuse view to be pretty attractive, actually, for a lot of evolutionary reasons, as well as just fits the data pretty well, that different nodes in the nervous system can be implicated in a lot of different psychological activities. But that's an empirical debate that's, I think, going to solve that. But I think that hylomorphism can find its way to be compatible with all of these different views. In other words, I don't think the ontology dictates what we're going to discover in the neuroscience here. All right, so another thing, this is something I've written a little bit about, but more like, if what I've written about is like a taster of this, which is true, then this is like you get like a little bit of an appetizer and you really don't get even the whole bite. What I'm going to try to do right now really quickly. There's a pretty large area of research in philosophy of biology described as the, not just philosophy of biology, but in philosophy of biology, as the new mechanist movement. A movement that wants to talk about not laws of nature, but thinking more about mechanisms. And I tend to, as being a more metaphysically minded person, think of it a lot like in terms of causal powers. But I think this has been a very fruitful area of research, and I also think that it has a lot of affinities with hylomorphism. There's a lot that hylomorphists should find attractive about some of the things that the new mechanists have done. Now, so far I've given a pretty hand-waving account of the way in which these psychological powers are materially hylomorphically, they're like zones of hylomorphic organization in the nervous system. But that's pretty hand-waving. It's not really clear, like, if the power of memory is like a hylomorphic zone in the nervous system of organization, what would that really look like? And I think the new Mechanist approach helps it to not be such a hand-waving approach of just saying, oh, well, there's some organization in the brain that's like the material components of the power of memory. Importantly for the new mechanists, because mechanism, some people are fans, some people are not fans. Aristotelians tend not to be fans of mechanisms, but I think these are mechanisms that Aristotelians could be friends with. I mean, maybe even cheer sometimes. For the new mechanists, mechanisms are not machines, they're not deterministic, they're not reductionist. Most of them, in fact, require multi-level irreducible ontic structures. And your other fancy diagram from the back is one of these examples of these multi-level mechanistic schemes. So that's the diagram you want to have for the next little one bite of a little bit of a canapé that we're going to go through for the new mechanists. They're not always localizable. Sometimes they can be highly distributed. And they're not fictions or metaphors. They often are like ontic. They're describing real features. They're carving actual parts of the nervous system. So given all these knots, mechanists are not pure apophaticists about their proposal. They think that mechanisms are entities and activities organized such that they exhibit the explanandum phenomenon. So what's that mean? So this is Carl Craver's model from his terrific book, The Explanation of the Brain. And these are these four features of a new mechanism. A new mechanism manifests some phenomenon. I'm going to give this a more causal powers kind of description than Craver would tend to do. But there's some activity, like some sighing, that is some psychological activity, so maybe an active memory. And whenever you have an active memory, that active memory is itself constituted from the composition of a bunch of component entities it's made out of. And those components can only have their activities with respect to each other that's generative of the actual psychological activity because of their active, temporal, and spatial relationships to each other. So you can see that this needs to be understood as a constitutive kind of relationship between these, where the psychological activity is composed of its components that are all interacting with each other, and the upshot is the psychological manifestation of some psychological activity. But this is often multi-level. So if you have the psychological activity, say something like some sort of memory for spatial navigation. And memory for spatial navigation requires a network of, amongst other things, neural assemblies in the medial temporal lobe or the hippocampus, something within the medial temporal lobe. And so you have all these different neural assemblies in the medial temporal lobe. But they themselves are composed of individual neurons. So we have to go down a level of looking at this neural network, looking at one neuron, maybe in a neural network. And that neuron can engage in the kind of spike train of action potentials it does within that neural network at this level, because that neuron is itself composed of a bunch of components, right? That neuron is a cell. That cell's got a lipid bilayer. It's got all these proteins and things that are receptive of different types of neurotransmitters that are going to open and close its ion and potassium channels. So all of these components have to work together at this lower level in order for the neuron to have an action potential, for that neuron to be part of a neural assembly that is like a patterned firing of action potentials. And all those things need to be going on in order for some animal to be engaged in spatial navigation. And the thing about this new Mechanist approach is it's not just top-down, it's top-down and bottom-up, okay? So, and you can actually experimentally do these interventions from the top-down or bottom-up. So you can make the animal do something psychologically, and that's going to enlist all of the causal powers of the components in order to do the thing that the animal does as a whole. But you can also go in and you can disrupt it. You can either cull off a bunch of those neurons that are in that neural network, and the animal won't be able to any longer engage in the kind of spatial navigation. So this is one example that Craver goes through to try to map out all these levels. And so you have a mouse doing a navigation in a Morris water maze. That's the top level. But in order for the mouse to do that, it itself has to have a hippocampus and other things. But those are composed of the hippocampus that's generating a spatial map. But in order for that to happen, you have to have individual neurons within the hippocampus, and they're inducing long-term potentiation, which is a technical kind of habituation or memory that occurs in neurons. And that requires that you have NMDA receptors that are activating. So you can tell the story by either going at the top and seeing all the components that it's made out of, but you can give them drugs or do things that would distract or disrupt these MDA receptors, and it's going to affect the way in which the mouse actually runs the maze. So clearly what hylomorphists are doing as ontologists and what new mechanists are doing as philosophers of science are different, and that's different from what scientific inquiries in the neuroscience to try to figure this map out. But there is a way in which I think all these things interlocked. So there's an ontological story to be told if you go in for ontology, and that's what I think the hylomorphic story is doing. But even though we just had a taste of the canapé of what the new Mechanist approach is about, you can kind of see that I'm hand-waving a lot, but a little bit less hand-waving. This is a more tractable account of the types of sub-psychological things that are going on in the nervous system that constitute all these embodied powers. So there are a bunch of other things that we should look to experimental science for either adding to this Thomist anthropology, and this would be a significant, much more empirically robust way of filling out some of the details. It's not saying the philosopher has to do it. It has to be able to tell a story of how it's relevant to this neurobiological literature. Other things that come up that philosophers in general, Wittgensteinians, philosophers of mind, phenomenologists, and the whole Aristotelian tradition is really bad at overlooking, but it's especially, I think, bad for Thomists is because we recognize we're rational animals, and animals are developmental creatures that have to go through a lot of developmental transformations. So whenever you talk about free will as a philosopher, you just talk about an adult human being, and you just talk about an adult human being engaging in acts of free will. But there's never like an ontogenic story of all the kinds of enabling transformations that are required for the kind of being to be one that can engage in acts of memory, to engage in acts of free will or whatnot. So that's actually something else that psychological and developmental neurobiology can actually help a lot, is informing a way of thinking about all these powers. As you see, this whole list is just of powers, as if all the powers come out together at one time. But there's not an account of how they're interacting and how they're developmentally changing or transforming. All right. There are a lot of metaphysicians in the room, so they'll sigh of relief that we're onto the metaphysics. Maybe you'll get a whole bite of the canapé here, but we'll go through this very quickly. So there are a number of things that you would have to do after you've done some of this work or tried to get a handle on this work, is that none of those things are going to tell us what are the real powers. It's going to give us sort of a feel for what the kind of subdivisions and taxonomies we want to make. How does the Wittgensteinian approach help us see how complicated our different psychological activities are? How does the neurobiology and the psychology maybe teach us some things we didn't notice, things like developmental psychology, but also inform some of that picture? But it hasn't yet told us, like, what are the metaphysics of the powers? Are we really going to end up with just the same 13 powers that Aquinas has? Or are we going to just have sentient powers and rational powers? Or are they all going to be like just modal kind of subdivisions of one thing we call mind or one thing we call consciousness? So we're going to have to engage in this metaphysical task of the individuation or the differentiation of psychological powers. We're going to also have to fill out the kind of story I just mentioned here of hylomorphism and the new mechanisms. And then we're also going to have to engage in this disputed issue about the immateriality of intellectual operations. Are there good, defensible arguments, given what we know now about comparative psychology with humans and other animals, study of primates, of cetaceans, of cephalopods? Do we have still substantive arguments for arguing for the immateriality of the intellect? And if so, how do those intellectual operations interact with these psychosomatic, neurobiologically embodied psychological powers? So what are the correct psychological powers? And what are their hylomorphically constituted organs? Again, I don't think we have good reasons for defending this view of the ventricle doctrine. We should move on to something like a neural systems, neuroglial systems approach of a much more sophisticated subpsychological system. So the first questions we'd have to ask are, just looking at Aquinas's, are there 5 external senses? Or maybe there are more. There's different kinds of senses also that other animals have and don't necessarily have the same external senses we have. What about this doctrine of these 4 internal sense powers? Albert the Great had 4, and Averroes had 4, but they didn't have these 4. They had 4 different ones. And Avicenna actually, and this is actually an illustration of Avicenna's psychology and the division, not actually Aquinas's. Avicenna had 5 internal senses. So even in that scholastic time period, there was disagreement about them. I've also mentioned that there's this issue about somatic pleasures and pains. But then also think about all these things that a lot of psychologists today talk about and neurobiologists talk about and have identified pretty robustly at least certain parts of the nervous system that somehow enable these different psychological level powers. Aquinas has very little to say about consciousness and conscious attention. A little bit, but it's not enough to have a systematic theoretical account as it stands. What about things like proprioception and interoception? Things like cognitive control or executive functions, things that go under the label of working memory, behavioral inhibition, cognitive flexibility, things that are thought to be very frontal lobe located. This divisions between experiential and factual memory, some of the subdivisions of long-term memory, things like language apprehension and production. These are like robustly identifiable in certain nodes or networks in the nervous system. But Aquinas doesn't have any sort of he doesn't have an organ necessarily that he thinks has to be given over to the power or powers required for language apprehension and production. There's also all sorts of types of Pavlovian and Skinnerian conditioning, different types of classical conditioning and instrumental conditioning. These are things that they're not necessarily thinking about. Where does that go? And then again, subdivisions of like motivations, moods, attitudes, and affective states. So there's a lot of questions about these, and we'd have to problematize and interrogate all of these psychological constructs using this whole procedure I've described, going through the Wittgensteinian stuff, the phenomenology stuff, as well as looking at the experimental things. But how many of these are actually going to be metaphysically individuated powers? We have the very beautiful Abyssinian psychology. We have phrenology. But now we're doing these sorts of things, like this is Russ Poldrack's attempt to develop a cognitive atlas by doing lots and lots of imaging and then having people do various psychological activities. And he thinks all of our concepts like memory or long-term memory or some of these psychological constructs, they all have like a social kind factor that he wants to try to eliminate by trying to build up a cognitive ontology based on the imaging data. A slightly different approach, and this is like the most spectacular stuff I think, is this is out of Gallant Labs, and this is what the video was that I was showing earlier. Gallant Labs is doing things like putting people in an MRI in the magnet, as he says, for 8 hours, and just putting a few people in for 8 hours, not necessarily at the same time. Not all at once. And some people, like even longer than that, watching lots of film or listening to audio or like podcasts or these sorts of things. And the reason is he doesn't want something that's like task specific to one psychological factor to only be looking at one part of the brain. Because part of the issue too is that it often takes somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes for new synapses, new neural connections to form. And they will change over the course of a day, over the course of a week. And so you put somebody in a machine, you're going to get slight differences, not huge differences. So what Gallant Labs are trying to do, which is very expensive, is they're trying to get tons and tons of hours of people where they're watching movies and watching films. And then what the magnet, as he calls it, is the way that the fMRI is doing it is it's trying to pick up what are all the stereotypical patterns that occur when someone's watching Steve Martin in a certain clip. And then they will re-image them. How does it work? They're trying to reconstitute the image just on the basis of the pattern firings of what the image would actually look like. And so there's a huge covariation process that they're going through. Anyway, go check out Gallant Labs and see some of the crazy stuff that he's doing. There are a number of issues here. So one of the tests he's doing here, they've got something like 950 semantic units, and they're distinguishing between semantic linguistic units and then like visual units, and seeing to what degree semantic linguistic units or concepts map up. So like the concept or the idea of a dog, and then like the visual perception of a dog, like in a video. So what degree those areas of the brain overlap, and what degrees they don't. Now, I would have all the same Wittgensteinian problems I had about Thomism and that I had about other cognitive science with the 950 concepts that he comes up with there. But anyway, it's really, really interesting, rich research project. But this is the kind of thing that's saying, so what the different colors are, you can't see, but there's different semantic units there, and then they're colored in various ways. So there's words like communal, social, emotional. Those are more purple and red. Or like numeric values, or like time or visual. Those are more green. And you can see in this flattened out and inflated brain, you can see where the distribution is over a very, very long period of time. These are more like probabilistic units of what's likely to happen in one person, and they're trying not to do a lot of the smoothing that a lot of neuroscientists do with fMRI. But anyway, the point is that he's just trying to show you how highly distributed some of these visual concepts can be, not just in the occipital lobe, but all over the place, and how highly distributed some of these semantic units can be, not just in a linguistic area or a memory area, but they can be distributed in the frontal lobe or things like that. So this sort of raises questions of like, is there going to be something like even close to a one-to-one mapping of the way in which the psychology is embodied in a nervous system that's pretty dynamic and is often changing in various ways? I don't have answers to any of those questions. I'm just saying these are like questions to ask and problems to think about. So this is the division that you have in Thomas. How would you go about defending it? Well, these are the disputed questions you'd have to be engaging in. They're really difficult, disputed questions. And I think I will skip and leave you with this. So what I did is I tried to give you one contentious, very quick version of Aquinas' Anthropology and a kind of careful exegetical reading. Tried to raise a bunch of different ways in which you would test that taxonomy, as well as the taxonomies that are used in different neuroscience. And there's not one. I mean, these research programs are so divided. I mean, when I was at Cambridge, there'd be people down at the one end of the hall doing something that was called something else, that published in different journals, that called their tasks a different kind of thing. And then one floor up, someone's doing a different field of research that looks pretty similar to me. I mean, I'm naive about these things, but it is pretty similar. Go to different conferences, publish in different journals, and some of it's going to be overlapping and some of it's going to be unique and different. So you shouldn't treat philosophers or neuroscientists as like a cookie cutter shape. They're very, very different. But we're going to have to test all of these different kinds of taxonomies. But what I think are the real neuroscientific challenges with respect to Aquinas comes from the way in which neuroscience helps but also makes more difficult the task of how do you differentiate these psychological powers, as well as then independent philosophical arguments about how do you defend the immateriality of the intellect, and what kind of a counter you're going to give a way in which the intellect interacts with these embodied psychosomatic powers. With that, I will conclude. Thank you for your attention.